My name is Colin Laroque. I'm Métis from Saskatchewan. My family is from the Duck Lake area. One of the things I'm best known for, though, is helping to date one of the oldest hockey sticks in Canada. Nothing means more to more Canadians than hockey, and we got it down to a very narrow window of about 1838, so some of the first hockey sticks ever carved by some shipbuilders near Pottles Lake, North Sydney, in Cape Breton, was made, and they were playing hockey back then. I have a tree ring lab, so I'm looking at the environment basically through the use of trees and all that they can tell us about the environment. Most of us have maybe sat around a fire or seen a stump or something like that and counted those rings that are on a stump or in a piece of wood. What I do is I look at those rings and I use those rings to tell me a bit about the environment and what the growing conditions of where that piece of wood was like. The rings are really interesting because of the long past history, and if the tree was 100 years old, I can go into wherever it was growing and I can see the past environment, and I just got to look at it the right way, ask the tree the right questions, and I can get that information back. And even though I wasn't there 100 years ago, and maybe no one was there, if you go to a remote location wherever that tree was growing, the tree's been incorporating signals from its environment and put it in there. And one of the most common signals that you can put in to make a plant grow is the climate. So things like precipitation or moisture contents and temperature. There's so much that we can ask of a tree because they're there and they're growing the same way year after year, and they're very consistent. And they're like the elders of the forest in my mind. They're there and they're longer and a better, longer perspective than we do as an individual human. What I like to do is to say we have these future forecasted models, and just because the trees have grown one way in the past, they're going to grow slightly different in the future. So here's an example from a northern Labrador, uppermost tree line. This is like, you got Arctic tundra on one side, and these are some of the first trees that you kind of encounter. 1728 was when it was born. But as you zoom in and focus, there's multiple rings in there. They all start to come in. The tree's only growing 1 or 2 or 3 cells a year. It's such a harsh growing climate. And in this tree at least, this is in the 40s, in the 30s and the 40s up at the Arctic tundra. Very cold climate conditions. And in that last sort of 60 to 80 years, we're seeing that it really expanding. And it doesn't show it much, but again, for such a small tree up in a very harsh environment, it's suddenly blossoming. It's really going crazy. And we're seeing the warming up, and certain tree species are starting to do much better than they have. The classic, if you go up there, is all white spruce trees. But now, if there is any kind of large tamarack trees up there, they're just doing phenomenal. And they're getting all that extra temperature that you're having up in that location, and they're just blossoming, and they're growing much longer and in a much better conditions than they ever have been in the last 300 or 400 years. So you're seeing some of these longer term climate cycles. We're used to thinking of things in humans' time periods, or when I was a kid, and that's 30 or 40 years ago. From a tree, it could be 200 or 300 years where you're seeing some of these long-term changes that it's easy to see even in one visual image of a tree, which it's very difficult to sit down and actually put into perspective from a human timeline. So that's part of the problem, is that the people that are going to be doing some of these things have to trust the words of a tree to say, I've lived longer than you, I know how it can be, and some of this stuff that I'm seeing now, I've never seen before. Here's an example from some white spruce in the southern boreal forest. So now we're on the southern edge, and these are the ones that I assume are going to start to do worse and worse, and we're starting to see that. So if we put them in and we take a look at them underneath the microscope, and suddenly you can see the rings. Here's the bark up here on this side, and so this was the 2015 ring, 14, 13, 12, and moving along. And you just see a dramatic decrease in the kinds of growth, and you get some of these really crazy rings when you get into these some of these more extreme kinds of climates that we're seeing. Some of these trees started doing really poor, and they were getting really susceptible, so that when something extreme came along, like let's say the spring of 2016 when you had no snow, it was unusually warm, it was unusually dry, and these trees were not healthy as it stood out. They were just waiting for something bad to happen, and then you could have, let's say, a fire get started, like the Fort McMurray fire, and pretty soon all that area was susceptible to fire in the first place. They're not healthy, they're putting down more dried out timber, and then you had this huge fire, a huge crown fire that started throwing, and it started creating its own weather patterns. It was so large, and that's, again, the biggest fire we've ever had is in this time period because the forest is getting more susceptible for it, the climate conditions are set up for it, and then a few weeks after the big fires are put out, they were having flooding, right? We went from one extreme to another extreme, and these are the kinds of things that are setting up, and the trees aren't able to take maybe all the moisture during a flood because it goes in and it's gone right away. No more normal. Everything is looking kind of crazy. And that's our last sort of decade, right? All of our future forecasts suggest that we're getting closer and we're starting to see more evidence of these extreme events that are going to be much more common, and we got to understand our plants out there. Knowing and understanding how these were reacting will be able to help us adapt to the kind of some of these changing extremes that we're getting to in the future. From a First Nations perspective, you often teach in stories. And very often with an elder, you'll listen to the same story over and over and over sometimes, and you go, oh, you know, I'm never learning something. But eventually, as time goes on, you come back and say, you know, I heard that story so many times, there's something else deeper in that story. And I think of that often when I'm working with my trees. I'm saying, you know, let's re-ask that question. Let's listen to the same story over and over until it actually gets through. I always keep that, and I keep the ideas of my grandparents and their stories in my head because I think there's still so much for me to learn in that, you know. And eventually I'll stop learning someday, but I don't know when that's going to be. And hopefully I'm still learning from them too, you know, because even when they pass, those stories will live in my head because I've heard them so many times, and I think there's so much to learn there.